According to August Nims, who works in the Department of Political Science and African American Studies at the University of Minnesota, says the Civil Rights Act was passed first and people were disappointed with the results because African Americans could vote, but the literary tests in the southern states were too hard for people to pass in order to vote. They fought for this right, and after a year, the Voting Rights Act was passed. They fought through Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March, and they fought in Birmingham to get their rights. There were even riots after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and people were still fighting for equality. The long, hot summers were just starting, and they ended in 1968 after Martin Luther King's assassination. There was progress made with the voting rights, but because of disenfranchisement laws, it is now harder for minorities to vote.
Civil Rights Act of 1964. Of course, before the Civil Rights Movement, racism and discrimination was at its highest. Following the Civil War, the legislature passed a trio of acts that abolished slavery, granted citizenship to former slaves, and gave all men the right to vote. Even with this advancement for African Americans, the southern states secretly kept them limited with literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers that didn't allow them to excel. Decades later, the legislature still did not pass civil rights acts even with all the evident racism going around the United States. Then, during the 1960s, President Kennedy imposed the idea of the Civil Rights Act. However, the legislature still did not permit it. Once Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson took control and made a push for its passing. The Civil Rights Act officially passed in 1964. Under this act, all segregation based on race, religion, or origin was prohibited in public spaces. It helped push for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the Fair Housing Act. It did help push for more equality in America, however, it took forever for full desegregation to start. The act has had positive impacts on America's society today as we are integrated. The minorities of the United States have made strides in the corporate world, entertainment world, and any other field of occupation that we have. Although the Civil Rights Act did allow for a more integrated society, there are still major race issues between African Americans and Caucasians today. The solution or solutions are still a mystery, but it takes more than just an act or a law to fix an issue so complex.
Brown versus Board of Education 1. At first, African Americans were discriminated against and educated differently from whites. They went to separate schools with a poor education system. This led to Brown versus Board of Education 1. On May 14, 1954, Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren ruled unanimously that state-sanctioned segregation of public schools were ruled unconstitutional and went against the 14th Amendment, which grants all citizens life, liberty, or property. This court ruling overturned the separate but equal decision of the Plessy v. Ferguson case 60 years earlier. Even with the decision of the Brown v. Board of Education 1, states still refused to desegregate public schools and eradicate their sanctions. This led to Brown v. Board of Education 2. In May 31, 1955, Chief Justice Warren reiterated the court's unanimous decision and enforced the rule to the states to begin desegregating public schools with all deliberate speed. Despite two unanimous rulings in court, desegregation of schools caused many segregationist whites to become disgruntled, and African American students still face prejudice and hostility, as in the case of the Little Rock. In September 4, 1957, 9 African American students were enrolled in a formerly all-white school, Central High, in Little Rock, Arkansas. As a retaliation against the federal ruling, Governor Orville Faubus called in the state's National Guard to block the students' entry into the school. Later that month, President Dwight Eisenhower sent in federal troops to escort the students to school and to protect them from the angry mob outside. In September 25, 1957, the students of the Little Rock Nine finally began their first full day of school. The ruling of the Brown v. Board of Education case made an impact on society now. Today, many schools have a strong policy against discrimination and prejudice to students, and integration remain prevalent. All schools are required to admit students and consider every student equally.
Before affirmative action was passed as law in 1961, African Americans were denied representation in the workplace as well as other areas due to their race. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X worked to solve this problem by canceling out the racial quotas. Martin Luther King Jr. met with Lyndon B. Johnson in order to discuss allowing African Americans to be represented in all areas, like the workplace, without being discriminated against because of their race. This was to aim at helping traditionally unrepresented groups in order to add to overall social justice and equality, including with women, veterans, and people with disabilities. The passing of this legislation has allowed African Americans to study at elite universities and also have more advantages when starting in the workplace than they ever had before. In 1960, 55% of all African Americans lived under the poverty line, which went down to a third in the 1990s and less than a quarter at 24% today. As a result of affirmative action, there have been many more openings in the business world for African Americans. The 1961 passing of affirmative action as a law prohibiting this discrimination has still maintained controversy among people today, who claim affirmative action is a preference program that only establishes racial differences. Now, a generation later, there is an increase in white hostility toward affirmative action. In their view, the past years of affirmative action have been enough to compensate, and now affirmative action is creating unfair advantages to minorities and taking from whites.